The final point of discussion we need to have in the Byzantine Empire is about the role of the monastery. The monastery is going to affect our discussion through the end of the course, but I like to introduce it here because this is where you start to see the monastic community emerge as an idea. And why was the monastery becoming popular? As Christianity was rising, of course, many people wanted to turn to a solely religious life, right? They wanted to commit themselves completely to the religious order, right? They wanted to have a place where they could live a completely spiritual life. And so the monastic community rose to meet that need. The convents, right, the nunneries, right, will come around about 300 years later, right? So the monastic community emerges before we see the convents. So the men were doing this long before the women were, just FYI. Now, why be interested in the monastic community? Because it was a place where a lot of Christian art was made. So to ignore it is to ignore a primary driver of artistic production. They made icons, right? They made book arts, right? So they're very involved in pushing items out right into the community and being an economic engine in a sense for art making. You'll notice looking at St. Catherine's that these were places that were meant for reflection. And so, because of that, they were usually walled, they were usually secluded, right? They were usually in places that were not very accessible. St. Catherine's is in Mount Sinai in Egypt. It's not very easy to get to. So there were places where people wanted to be away from the world, right? And they were self-serving communities, right? They were self-enclosed communities. They definitely were able to make everything that they needed to survive. So they created their own food, right? They created their own, economy in a sense by trading these items. It's a very interesting mechanism for creating an economy that could support itself, right? Of course, the monastic community also relies on pilgrims. Today we would call them tourists, right? But pilgrimage becomes a very important thing and continues into the medieval period. So we'll talk more about pilgrimage as a practice. But this was people coming to the monastic community often to see something that was there. And then while they were there, the monks could sell them things, right? And use that economy to survive, right? In the case of Mount Sinai, they're famous for the burning bush. So if you know the story of the burning bush, the Ten Commandments, all of that, right? This is said to be where the burning bush is. It's obviously a descendant of the bush, it's not the bush. If you're, into gardening, you take transplants and keep on moving the descendants on down through the years, right? And I was doing some research on the monastic community once, and I found this image of a fire extinguisher next to the burning bush, and I was like, okay, that's someone's idea of a hilarious joke, and I love a hilarious joke, so here, there you go. But these communities, they would try to have something that was, a draw, let's say, that would bring in your tourists, right? You bring in your pilgrims and get them to come to your location and interact with that holy object or that holy thing. And again, while you were there, you'd probably get some icons, right? So it was good for the monks. It was good for the Christians, right? So it becomes its own little microcosm, right, of an economy. It's really fascinating to study. Now, as I mentioned, at these monasteries, you had a lot of art production. And one of the main types of art production, of course, were icons. Icons were made for individuals to buy and take with them for worship purposes. This will become its own issue, so we'll talk about this in a minute. Here you have a famous icon of Mary with saints. To be specific, these are Saints Theodore on the left and Saint George on the right. So if you're interested in your saints, you have Saints Theodore and Saint George, and of course the angels in the background. You'll also notice the hand of God kind of peeking down there in the top. But these are things that could be made and people could take them home and use them for prayer, for introspection, right? They're meant to guide, right, people in their religious endeavors. So they're not very big. There's something you could strap to the side of a donkey, put in a pouch, right? So they're not very large pieces. Mary was a favorite along with various saints for these icons. Mary, especially because, as I mentioned, they're trying to think about how to position Mary at this time. You'll notice the Council of Ephesus. This was a famous meeting where the church fathers got together to kind of talk about various issues about getting the church up and running. What are our rules? What are our beliefs, right? And one of them was like, well, what about Mary, right? Because if you read biblical text, she's there in the beginning and she's there in the end, but in the middle, she's just nowhere, right? like how do we deal with Mary? And the council was like, well, she has to be treated as a holy figure. She's the mother of God, blah 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 blah. What do we do with her? And so they decided they would start to promote her in icons. And how they promoted her was as the Theotokos. And it's the Greek term Theotokos. It means the bearer of God, because she bore him, she gave birth to him. But you'll notice in the imagery, she's also bearing him or holding him as well. So it's a double meaning, right? It works both ways. She bore him, she gave birth, but she also holds him, she bears him, right? And so this is how you'll notice Mary starts to be imaged. And tell me if I'm wrong, she's imaged all the way through Christian art in this way as the Theotokos. It's her primary way that she's shown, with her halo, the blue Marian robe, holding Christ, right? That's how she's shown. Um, how do these function though? They're meant to be what we call intercessors, right? Where you could confess or whatever, talk to Mary, pray to Mary, and she would intercede between you and God. So that hand of God at the top kind of coming down, it's like she was like the connection you had to God, right? She was your intercessor, your go-between. And so many people thought of icons as working in this way, that it was like using something as a go-between between yourself and God. And of course, that will lead to more problems, as I mentioned. And we'll talk about that in a second. There's a great video on icons I gave you with Father Honeycutt. Make sure you watch that. It's really good stuff. He's amazing. And he gets to a lot of, it's not, I don't need to re explain what he says because he really sums it up quite well about what icons are, how the imagery is used. So go check that out. Materials, these are wood panels typically. And you see a new different type of material here that you probably haven't seen before in painting, which is encaustic. Encaustic is pigment and wax mixed together. And encaustic works great on wood boards because, again, it seals to the wood. Right? If you've ever spilled wax on something, you know what I'm talking about. It's hard to get off. So you mix the pigment into the wax and then seal it onto the wood through the painting method. You'll notice lots of gold leafing here, of course. These are Byzantine people. And you'll notice, again, a lack of realism. You got these stunty bodies, right? You got these robes thrown on people. Things aren't very proportional. Everyone's shoved into the scene. It's like very crowded and cramped. But I always point to the decorations on the saints' robes as showing you what stylization is interested in, which is more pattern, more decoration than realism. So we see a little hint of that, right, coming through in this piece. As I mentioned, icons will become problematic. And it'll lead to the iconoclastic movement of 1726 to 1843, or sorry, 843, not that long, not 1843, 726 to 843 AD. It begins under the Emperor Leo III, and his mentality is that icons are a violation of the second commandment. So just like Jews and Muslims, he says, this is something we shouldn't be doing. Now, people talk about why is that? Was it purely religious? Or did Leo see the monasteries creating their own economy, standing outside of his taxation and say, whoa, 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 hold up a minute? So you can debate whether this was a purely religious move, right, or whether this is somewhat of an economic move on his part, a power move on his part. But it turns the art making to aniconism for over 100 years, which is significant. The people hated it though, right? Here you see an image related to iconoclasm of like trying to cleanse images, cleaning them. So this guy kind of has an icon, a stick, like he's about to dump it into holy water or something. People thought this was madness, right? They hated what was happening to their arts. And so when icons are allowed to return at the end of this period, people are quite pleased. So it's over 100 years of iconic artwork, and then you see icons come on back. Unfortunately, during the iconoclastic period, many artworks were destroyed. They were burned. So like the one I showed you of Mary, the original piece I showed you of Mary, that was hidden away in a monastery. That was actually hidden up in Mount Sinai in the St. Catherine's Monastery, and it was like nobody could get to it, so they didn't know it was there. Other icons that survive are in outlying areas of the Byzantine Empire. So artists really had a lot to struggle against when aniconic practice ended because they didn't have a lot of good examples anymore. So if you look at these images that you're seeing here, you may notice they're even less realistic than some of the stuff we were seeing before. Because again, they haven't had any art to look at for like, over a century. So they're like, over 100 years. So they're like, what the heck are we looking at here? This is difficult to even consider. Again, you see a lot of this lack of realism in a lot of the things you're seeing here. The Vladimir Virgin, you can see how far Mary's come as the Theotokos, right? You're still using that setup of the bearer of God. Notice the lack of realism, right, in the Christ child. And then the Panodicrator means Christ as judge. And so I wanted to mention, notice how Christ's image is changing, where he used to be like the good shepherd, he was very accessible. Now he's a judge, right? He's more negative, right? These are images you'd see up in the domes of churches, right? So he'd be looking down on you, sort of judging you, right, in this very dramatic, kind of fashion. Notice his hand on the Bible if you want to see a lack of realism, right? That weird spider hand looked very strange. Again, there's all the gold, very typical of Byzantine art. And then you have this crucifixion scene from the Church of Daphne that again gets to the heart of how hollow a lot of these works often looked emotionally. I mean, it's the crucifixion, and it's so static, it's so still. There's no pain, there's no suffering. I love the blood just boop out of the side, very stylized. Mary and St. John are kind of like there, yeah, hey, there he is, and again, it's a hallmark of the Byzantine look, right? This hollow, sort of emotionless look. Again, notice all the gold, very stylistic to what Byzantine artists often did. The Byzantine Empire ends with the rise of Islam. You have the invasion of the Ottoman Empire in 1453 and the definitive end of the Roman Empire. Now I'm showing you here an image of Mecca, right, with the Kaaba in the center. This is not in Constantinople or in Istanbul, this is in Mecca, right? But I wanted you to have an image related to Islam as we ended our discussion of the Byzantines, and understanding that the fall of Byzantium is linked directly to the Islamic forces of the Ottoman Empire. But this is the definitive end of the Romans, so wave goodbye, right, to the Romans. They served us well, but that's it for the Romans.